I absolutely hate time travel. Time travel is among the worst things to ever happen to film. No, fiction as a whole. Not because I don't find it interesting, I do. But by its very nature, it contradicts itself, causes plot lines to get muddled and unclear, and worst of all, it creates implications that the writers themselves forget to consider. It takes a very talented writer to consider all the things that could go wrong with time travel and account for them, and still deliver a competent and well put together story. And Phase 4 MCU writers are anything but that. Before getting into the plot, let's talk about the look and feel of Loki. The TVA, the Time Variance Authority, is the heart and soul of this season. We never really see the building itself, if it even is a building, but within, it has a very matter-of-fact 60s retro-futuristic design. The TVA was inspired by Soviet socialist, modernist, and brutalist architecture, sprinkling in a bit of American modern with the tacky repeating design of the carpet. It follows the fundamental modernist principle: form follows function. The director, Kate Herron, called the series an homage to Blade Runner, A Clockwork Orange, Zodiac, and Brazil, and that's very apparent in set design and lighting, if not in the quality of the writing. Silver-tipped bulbs are used as key lighting. You can see them here in the TVA waiting room as well. These tungsten light bulbs provide a similar beige-tinted look as in Zodiac. The silver tips are opaque. They block light from passing right through the bulb and instead reflect the light back into the lighting fixture. This makes the light dimmer, softer, and warmer, making the rooms feel boring and drab. Along with the bureaucratic institutional feel of the TVA, the light is almost sleep-inducing, but in a good way. The difference between hard light and soft light is most clearly seen here. The lighting on Loki is soft, while in the background, hard light shines out through a lighting fixture. The moody lighting of the Zodiac-esque TVA stood in stark contrast to the locations outside the TVA. The Roxcart, a futuristic Walmart, had fluorescent white lighting with a green kick, while the doomed moon of Lamentis 1 had neon pinks and purples. Lighting in this way clearly differentiates the locations and gives them their own tone, letting you know that you are somewhere new. Digital Domain, a special effects studio, was hired for one single episode, Episode 3, Lamentis. The studio gave the doomed moon a lot of character in the background. Mining equipment clutters the background while miners in shabby clothes mill about. Neon pinks and purple signs on old buildings flicker while meteorites strike the moon's surface. The episode culminates in an absolutely spectacular explosion, produced using a software called Houdini. Houdini is best known for its hyper-realistic smoke and fire effects, because of its procedural modeling of particle trajectories and their interactions. If you're at all interested in CGI or aesthetic world building, rewatch this episode because it is a masterclass in those subjects. Plot, not so much. Now let's get into the plot. Needless to say, there's gonna be a bunch of spoilers from here on out. The plot is both convoluted and extremely simple at the same time. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I hate time travel. If you turn your brain off at the exact moments time travel is mentioned, it's an extremely simple story. So, if we turn time travel off, the story is: Loki gets kidnapped by an authority because he did a naughty thing. He then is recruited by them to hunt down a fugitive who he has unique knowledge of. He ends up joining forces with this fugitive, forms a romantic bond with her, and takes down the head of this authority, which would have unintended consequences down the line. See? No hassle, no fuss. Except we really can't turn time travel off, so this gets far more complicated. So let's turn time travel back on and wade waist deep into these murky waters. The authority I spoke of is the TVA, the Time Variance Authority. Much like the plot itself, their job is both simple and extremely complicated. Previously, there were a bunch of universes that were at war with each other. So the timekeepers reduced it all to a single timeline and created the TVA. The TVA exists solely to prevent the formation of multiverses by destroying diverging timelines as they arise. We are informed in a cute little expository cartoon that these diverging timelines are caused by people doing things they shouldn't be doing, be it stealing the Tesseract and teleporting away, or simply being late to work one morning. These are called Nexus events. And if the timeline created by a Nexus event goes on for too long, it becomes unmanageable and could lead to another multiversal war. Except they cheapen the premise in this very same cartoon. If the timeline did go past the point of no return, they could very well just get the timekeepers to reset it. If the power to reduce a complex network of timelines and universes to a single one exists, why would I, the viewer, care at all about this arbitrary point of no return? Why the existence of a bunch of universes leads to war is also not explained at this point. It won't be explained until the very last episode, and the explanation, much like this entire season, is unsatisfactory. Let's look at the concept of a multiverse as defined by Loki. So let's say our universe was created by the Big Bang, a cosmic event that began at a single point and exploded outwards, inflating to the state we see it in today. Spectacular. A second universe, however, might have been created because you brewed the wrong kind of tea on one winter afternoon. Far less spectacular. Not to mention, it's fundamentally idiotic to suggest that a small decision made by a particular person at a particular moment in time creates a whole other universe for no reason at all. And imagine, if you will, having a conversation with someone from another universe. Oh hey, I'm from the Big Bang universe. Where are you from? That's cool, I'm from the Bob from Manchester made peppermint tea instead of Earl Grey tea on 13th November 1959 universe. Nice to meet ya. Doesn't quite have the same ring to it, does it? The plot takes place after the events of the Avengers, when Loki steals the Tesseract and teleports to Mongolia. According to the MCU timeline, this doesn't happen. This is a good time to introduce another concept that Loki is all about: variants. Variants are those that make the wrong choice and then get railroaded to the gulags by the TVA. When a wrong event occurs, two versions of the entire universe are created. This includes the person doing the deed that creates a Nexus event. So the Loki we are following through this show is not the Loki we have grown accustomed to, but a copy created because he took a different path to the timeline of the MCU. The MCU Loki is Loki Prime or Big Bang Loki, and this Loki is variant Loki, or I took the Tesseract and absconded to Mongolia Loki. So who is this show even for? At least the Falcon and the Winter Soldier and WandaVision had the good nature of being set within the timeline of the MCU, so the fans cared about them, at least a little. This is not only set primarily outside the MCU, it doesn't even star the Loki that the fans care about. I've said before that setting rules for fantasy and sci-fi worlds is incredibly important. Following those rules should be the easy bit, but Loki gets that wrong too. For example, Loki figures out that Nexus events don't happen just before an apocalypse, because everything that bears any temporal weight will be eliminated. Only a couple of episodes later, this rule is broken. Rules aren't red herrings, and telling your audience to forget what you told them only an episode ago cheapens any further rule setting. Another example is the creation of Nexus events. So we're told that simply arriving to work late one day could set off a temporal chain reaction that leads to the formation of multiverses. However, in the very first episode, we are informed that variants come in different shapes and sizes, and could even be an alligator. If simply arriving late to work one day causes a whole new universe to form, surely a female Loki or an alligator Loki should not even be allowed to exist in the first place? Our protagonist meets Sylvie, a female Loki variant, rather early into the show. It is shown to us that she was carted off to the TVA when she was about 8, maybe 10 years old. Shouldn't her timeline have been erased when her mother grew pregnant with a child with XX chromosomes? Surely race, gender, and even species are far more fundamental differences than brewing the wrong pot of tea or coming in 5 minutes late to work one Tuesday morning? Rules are sometimes not explicitly spoken out loud, but are shown to us while we watch the show. But when these rules aren't explicitly told to us, they behave differently. Each spell or technique Loki or Sylvie uses becomes another layer of complexity, another question asked when they come up against a new challenge. Much like the other rules, the show breaks these just as easily. Loki was shown to be capable of shape-shifting, teleporting, and we're even told he could cast illusions as well. There are several places in the plot where these abilities would have come in handy, and he never used them, instead opting for hand-to-hand combat with a dinky little dagger he summoned. Speaking of the dagger, he could materialize and dematerialize this at will. Why can't he do the same for other objects? Could he do it with people? Sylvie, on the other hand, seems to be capable of casting only a single spell, which sort of makes sense given how she had to teach herself magic while on the run. That being said, questions have to be asked about why Loki is so underpowered in his own show. WandaVision came out recently, and Wanda's powers outstrip Loki's so much it's laughable. I understand that Marvel is now a cottage industry and the showrunners working parallelly probably don't talk to each other very much, but come on now. While Loki is swinging around a little green dagger, Wanda is turning an entire town into NPCs, bringing her husband back from the dead and creating children out of thin air. A rather stark contrast. Unfortunately, Marvel Comics and the cinematic universe now has a problem with power creep. Characters keep getting stronger and the enemies more of a threat, so it stands to reason that an Asgardian god must at least be able to hold his own against the other sorcerers in this universe. Sadly, this Loki would fail miserably against Doctor Strange or Wanda Maximoff. And given that Loki's often at odds with the Avengers, this really isn't a good look. Generally speaking, I'm a strong opponent of power creep, favoring smaller stories with lower stakes to world-destroying threats. But an Asgardian sorcerer god shouldn't be fighting in hand-to-hand combat instead of casting spells, and he really should not be quite this weak. Loki the show attempts to rehabilitate Loki's character from being an anti-hero or an outright villain to being one of the good guys. At the start of the show, he's an egotistical braggart with lofty goals to be the king of Midgard and soon the universe. After being interrogated on why he does the things he does, he hits upon feelings of insecurity and loneliness, which, to be fair, would resonate with a lot of people. While a bit rushed, this character development was refreshing to see in the MCU, which usually doesn't bother with this sort of thing these days. But once you break a character down, especially one as central as Loki is to the show, it's important to build him back up again, to complete his arc, and they never do. Once he meets Sylvie, the female Loki variant, he essentially takes a back seat to her in his own damn show, and never really recovers his sense of purpose, which is ironic considering one of the show's key themes is glorious purpose. Meanwhile, Sylvie always has her wits about her, knows exactly what she wants to do, and achieves what she sets out to do by the end of the season. It wouldn't be unfair to say that this show is more about Sylvie than Loki himself.
This isn't about you.
Before we close out this review, I'll address one criticism and talk about time travel as per Loki. If that doesn't interest you, skip to this timestamp. One criticism of this show that I've seen on the internet is that free will didn't exist in the MCU up until after the end of season 1 of Loki and the destruction of the TVA as introduced to us. This isn't entirely correct in two ways. One, the people on the timeline still make decisions by themselves. They're simply punished for making the wrong ones. That still doesn't change that they made the right decision by themselves. Free will still exists on the timeline, but these characters' destinies do not change. Secondly, we need to be careful when we use the words before and after while talking about Loki. The TVA exists outside the flow of linear time in a different dimension. According to Owen Wilson's character, Mobius, the events on the timeline occur over and over again, which means time as envisioned by him, and by extension all inhabitants of the TVA, is as a loop. And since they can pick any time to travel to, all the events on the timeline are seen from the TVA as occurring simultaneously. We really can't think of time as linear anymore, but either as a grand loop or as individual moments stacked up on top of one another. However, there is a kind of time that passes in the TVA. Certainly the words before and after must have some weight, or else we couldn't talk about the sequence of events in Loki. So we have to introduce a new variable. Let's say our world is made up of 4 dimensions: length, breadth, height, and time. We now need to introduce a 5th dimension to conceptualize the passage of time in the TVA. Let's call this super time. Super time behaves exactly like time, but it can't be time because it is physically separate from the timeline. When you're in the plane of super time, you witness time as a loop, made of infinitesimally smaller loops. Let's call each one a differential of a unit of time, dt. So the integral of d by dt would be the entire timeline. Is that clear? No? Good, it's not meant to be. Now that we have introduced this new variable, the words before and after in the TVA have some meaning. But it would not be in units of time, but super time. The internet commentators were somewhat right, but in the plane of super time and not time. So let's address the restoration of this pseudo free will to the timeline. When Sylvie kills the man behind the TVA and the multiverses are formed, pseudo free will is restored to the timeline. Except this doesn't only apply to the MCU films and shows that are produced after Loki, but also retroactively. This concept now applies to all points on the timeline. We, the audience, cannot know for certain whether the events of the MCU as we know it occurred before or after the restoration of pseudo-free will. For all we know, the MCU occurred during a loop of the timeline after season 1 of Loki in super time. The worst part about all this analysis is that the writers of this show did not think about time travel half as much as I did, and probably do not care about the ramifications of these heady concepts on the universe at large. I need a cigarette and a nap. In the end, Loki only tells half a story, if that. It leaves a large portion of exposition to the very last episode with a character that isn't set up, so he doesn't have very much weight as an antagonist to us. They left the titular character half-developed, without a transformative arc that clearly defines his motivations and desires, his goals and purpose. The acting was top-notch though. Owen Wilson's quiet charm and Tom Hiddleston's charisma carried the show as far as they could. Wunmi Mosaku as Hunter B-15 did a phenomenal job, especially in scenes where she portrayed a silent existential crisis with her face. The music and audio mixing was serviceable, but not much to write home about. For all the talent that went into lighting, set design, and acting, the writing was what brings Loki down, as it does so many other shows and films. Unless you're a die-hard MCU fan, you can skip Loki. You really are not missing much.